Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of Bakhmut, where there has been an advance by the Russians within the village of Ivanivske and to the south of it. Here to the south of Ivanivske there's been two advancements. The first one is here in the central parts, where to the west of the Dacia area the Russians have managed to advance and move the front line to match with the forest line here to the west of the Dacia area, west of Bakhmut. And with this, the Russians have secured their southern flank for the attacks and storming of Ivanivske here to the north, where the Russians now have gained control over this small village area here to the south. And in the northern parts, they are capturing more and more of the Stepove street. Here to the northeast, the Russians have also captured the forest lines up to the village of Ivanivske. As such, they're able to launch attacks from pretty much any direction within this direction, so that they're able to storm the village and advance further within it. So we're seeing that the Russians are slowly advancing and inching through the eastern parts of Ivanivske, getting closer and closer to a proper foothold within the village. As Russians have captured multiple trenches here to the east of the village, they are now within the village core, in the sense that they have gone past the initial defenses and now their fighting has reached the central parts of the village, both here to the east of the village, but also in the northern parts, where they're trying to expand their zone of control, so they're able to send additional forces into the village and move further and further through it. It looks like the Russians are going to focus on the northern parts before moving on to the southern parts, with no special tactics being used other than them storming through the fortifications of the Ukrainians and then moving through the fortifications to move on to the next one before sending additional forces inside the village. And there's constantly bombardments both of artillery and FPV drones throughout the village at a 24/7 time frame. This advancement here to the south of Ivanivske also means that the Russians have secured the northern flank for the fighting over Klishivka. With this, the Russians can capture the final parts of the forest patch area and move on to the northern forest patch of Klishivka. It is likely that the Russians will restart offensive operations by Klishivka with this advancement, as it allows them to securely advance in the northern parts without worrying about the northern flank being cut off by a Ukrainian counterattack. At the same time, the Russians could have an interest in simply moving in the western direction through the southern parts of Ivanivske, or even entering Ivanivske from the south to allow them to expand their front line, depending on how the situation is in the east and northern parts of Ivanivske, similar to how they managed to advance in the northern parts from the Bohdunivka direction and all the way down south from Pomove and to Ivanivske. Moving down further south in the direction of Avdiivka, we have significant developments as the Russians have managed to gain further control over Sjeverne here to the south, leaving the whole village into the gray zone other than the parts that the Russians have gotten control of, and fighting continues over the western parts. As for the northern parts, the Russians have managed to fully capture Stepove, and with this the fighting can move on in a western direction towards Brigades. We see here that in the direction of Avdiivka, the three villages which had significant fighting, Stepove, Sjeverne, and Sjeverne, now ends up in a situation where Stepove is under Russian control, Sjeverne is halfway taken, and Sjeverne fighting is reaching the outskirts. So with this, we see that there are three different stages for these three different villages. And the most significant part with these developments is that in the direction of Sjeverne, we can see that the Russians are having the most difficulty capturing the village comparing to Stepove and Sjeverne, where they've captured Stepove and have gained half control of Sjeverne. And with the location of Sjeverne kind of isolated from the rest of them, it makes sense that the Ukrainians would put extra effort into defending the village. However, what we do see is that with the control over the coke plant to the north and the capture of Sjeverne in the future, the Russians would be able to launch offensive operations from these southern and northern directions towards Sjeverne from the gray zones here to the south and north of the village. With these developments, we can see that the Ukrainians would be in a situation where they would have to fend off attacks from three different directions, which would be immensely difficult for them. At the same time, the Russians would not have an interest in moving from Sjeverne to Tonenke. As we can see, Tonenke is pretty much defended from all sides with fortifications and forest lines all throughout the areas. In the northeastern parts, there's a fortified area, and the northwestern parts, there's the Dacia area that also has forest lines next to it. In the southwestern parts, there are also forest lines all throughout. So Tonenke is pretty much a fortress by itself, where it's very difficult to gain a foothold from any direction. The most weakened point would likely be here from the northeast, from the Orlivka direction. For that, the Russians will need to gain control over Orlivka, and we're seeing that they're moving in a western direction from the coke plant. They're also fighting over Lastochkine. If they manage to capture these two positions, to the west of the coke plants, the fortifications by the forest lines east of Orlivka, and Lastochkine to the south, the Russians will be able to move towards Orlivka from two directions through the two main supply routes from Lastochkine and from the coke plant. If the Russians move on and capture Orlivka, then they can move down to Tonenke from its weakest points, which is here from the northeast, both from Lastochkine and from the Orlivka directions. We also see that the Ukrainian positions here in the west of Avdiivka is actually very interesting, in the sense that if we take a closer look to the Pervomaisk and the Tailova direction, if the Russians manage to capture these two villages, you'll see that they will have control over all the parts to the south that is beside any sort of supply line. If we take a look here to the west, there is this area right here which can be passed through. But if the Russians move in a western direction from Pervomaisk, capturing the Tailova, they can move here and cut off this. Pretty much it's a major chokehold for any sort of supply line. If the Ukrainians want to use it, they would be prime targets for an ambush here in this section of the front line, because they'd have to concentrate their forces over a small gap. So the Russians would be able to, if they manage to capture Pervomaisk and Tailova, move in the northern direction and capture these villages, which would be pretty much isolated from direct supplies. In the northern section, we can see that there is this chain of villages, which could likely create some sort of fortification line for the Ukrainians. And we see that it moves here through the northern parts and is connected with the supply route that goes into these areas here to the south and to the east of it. So the Ukrainians would be able to supply through this. If the Russians move west of Stepove towards Brigades, capture that, and then down south, we'll see them capture this northern part. And if they move through Pervomaisk and Tailova in the northern direction to cut off the southern parts, which would leave Orlivka, Tonenke, Lastochkine, and so on without supply. So it is likely that the Russians, if they do not plan on moving further westwards from Stepove, Lastochkine, and Sjeverne, would simply go to the flanks and attack those instead of attacking directly towards them. There's also the possibility that they go through directly to Orlivka and then move in a western direction from it and then connect it here with the southern parts, which would also cut off Tonenke by itself. So there are multiple possibilities for which way the Russians will likely attack towards the west, but the point is there are multiple possibilities for the Russians to simply move in a western direction, depending on what targets they have, how fortified the different positions are, and so on, which I do not have that much information about. Therefore, I cannot tell you which way they're going to go. I'll just tell you about the possibilities. We have some interesting footage from the Stepove direction, which includes Ukrainian Abrams tank fighting in this direction between Brigades and Stepove. It shoots as Russian positions by the forest line and so on. The video shows an Abrams tanks moving back and forth in this road here between Stepove and Brigades as it is shooting. This footage was also geolocated by Ryber, and with this we see that the Ukrainians have been using the Abrams tanks. According to the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which is operating them, they've been using it for about a month now. And with this we see that there is going to be the commitment of the final tanks that we haven't really seen at the front line, the Abrams tank. And already with this we see right now that one of those Abrams chases, not the tank itself, but one of the chases, which is equipped with some mine clearing equipment instead of the normal Abrams tanks, has been destroyed in the Stepove direction, where we see this one right here. It's been damaged, not really destroyed, but it's been abandoned. The Ukrainians did not manage to pick it up, and it is somewhere here to the west of Stepove. I'm not really sure exactly where it is. But with this, we see that there is the first confirmed loss of a Ukrainian Abrams chassis, although it's not the tank itself. Instead, what we do see is that there is this Abrams tank here, which is a standard Abrams tanks, and it is just abandoned here by a roadside. The question is this one also destroyed? Is it just damaged? It's clearly not destroyed. Is it damaged? Or why is it abandoned near the front line? It makes no sense. It's a very dangerous position for it to be standing still. So this adds up the quote-unquote losses of Abrams tanks already to 2, depending on what the situation here or what the context is here. But it's very hard to find context to a tank just sitting there close to the front line. With these developments, we see that we generally see that the Russians are making some small advancements, storming important villages by the front line, and they're seeing some success as days go by. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.